Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to the first of two webinars over the NTIA notices of funding opportunities that were published about the middle of May. Today, we'll be discussing the Broadband Expansion and Deployment Program, as well as the Digital Equity Act programming. So for those of you that don't know, I'm pretty sure everybody coming today does, but Buckeye Hills Regional Council, we're a council of governments dedicated to improving the lives of residents in Southeast Ohio. We work collaboratively with elected officials across Athens, Hocking, Meigs, Monroe, Morgan, Noble, Perry, and Washington counties. And we grow strong communities through our 5 divisions: aging and disability, community development, mapping and data, population health, and transportation planning. And believe it or not, broadband covers every single one of those divisions. Inevitably, when I talk about broadband, I can talk about anything in all 5 of those divisions. So first, here's a layout of all of the IJA funding, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or as it's known now as BILL, which is Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The governing entity over these funds will be NTIA. And the BEAD program has a total of $42.25 billion. State funding for BEAD will be calculated by first determining the high cost allocation, then followed by the remaining funds allocation. Each fund is calculated by dividing the number of unserved households by the number of underserved, and then multiplying that by the 4.2545 billion for the high cost area. And then whatever funds remain after that, they'll do that formula again, but then multiply it by the remaining funds. But states, no matter what, will receive a minimum $100 million allocation for programming. So what does the BEAD timeline look like? So I included a visual timeline at the bottom for those that prefer a visual representation, or we can just read the timeline up here. So the NOFO went live on May 13th. LOI, the letter of intent from the states, are due by July 18th. Having spoken with Peter and the state broadband office several times, they have worked on it and it's pretty much finalized. They're just waiting for the governor and the legislator to finalize all of it. But once the letter of intent is received, the state entity will then receive $5 million in planning funds, our state entity being our state broadband office. They will then put together a 5-year action plan, which is due 270 days after planning funds are received. Along with that, they will be working on their initial proposal, which is due 180 days after the FCC publishes new maps, which we honestly do not know at this point. They've been asking ISPs for the data on their end. The map mesh opened up, I think a couple weeks ago officially, for people to start putting data in there, and the ISPs, their data is due by mid-September. But then after that, there will be a challenge period where all the states can view the maps and be like, hey, we don't think this is accurate. And the maps will then be revised and republished. But once the initial proposal is approved after that, 20% of the full allocation will then be awarded to the state. A final proposal is due 1 calendar year after the initial proposal is approved, and then the final approval will see the other 80% of the allocation awarded to the state. And it does not matter whether the timeline starts as soon as that initial proposal is approved and they receive 20% of the full allocation. There is then a 4-year implementation period for all of the funds. So what are the BEAD priorities? So the number 1 priority, and this is listed in how the funds will be spent. First, the funds have to go towards deploying broadband service to unserved areas. Unserved is defined as having no connection or less than 25 megabits per second up, 3 megabits per second down, or being served by an unreliable technology. And that's for areas that are primarily only served by satellite and served by outdated wireless technologies. So once the funds are used for that, once all unserved areas are connected, it can then go to connecting underserved areas. Underserved being defined as greater than 25 megabits per second and the 3 megabits per second down, but less than the standard of internet, which is 100 megabits per second up, 20 megabits per second down. That is then followed by connecting community anchor institutions that have less than a gigabit symmetrical service. And then remaining funds, if any, can be used for eligible access, adoption, and equity issues. And then the asterisk down there from above, the eligible entities must prioritize projects that rely on entirely fiber optic technology to each end user premises. So it must focus on fiber to the premises technology, which is a huge win. So what are some requirements for BEAD? So networks are required to offer at least 100 megabits symmetrical service or 100 megabits up, 20 megabits down in high cost areas. There is a 25% matching requirement from either the state or from the sub-grantees that the state grants funds to, but matching funds can be waived in high cost areas, which if we are to believe the formula that has been put out, much of southeastern Ohio will be counted as a high cost area. The state must coordinate with stakeholders when creating their 5-year action plan and proposals for the funding. And so the state will be reaching out to us and several stakeholders throughout the entire state in order to put together that action plan and what's going to be done. A big win for digital equity is that both a low-cost option and a middle-class affordable plan must be offered by sub-grantees. Those plans will be defined in the state proposal. The low-cost option has been part of previous programs, and it's mostly been tied to the Affordable Connectivity Program or the Emergency Broadband Benefit, as it used to be called. But the middle-class affordable plan being there for families that maybe don't qualify for assistance programs, but are just above it, that is huge, and it's going to make sure that everyone has access to good internet. Having just mentioned it, sub-grantees are required to participate in the Affordable Connectivity Program, and then the eligible entity may not exclude as a class cooperatives, nonprofit organizations, public-private partnerships, private companies, public or private utilities, public utility districts, or local governments from eligibility to apply for these funds. And another big thing is, if after soliciting proposals, the eligible entity has received no proposals to serve a location or group of locations that are unserved, underserved, or a combination of unserved and underserved, the eligible entity may engage with existing providers or other prospective sub-grantees to find providers willing to expand their existing or proposed service areas. So for the areas of the region that don't see any interest, if they will get interest for it, the state is required to go out and find somebody to serve that area as long as there are funds remaining. An eligible entity may consider inducements such as a use of state funding towards the matching requirement or benefits during the selection process, points or credits. The eligible entity shall, in that circumstance, work to ensure that this approach is as transparent as possible so that we know what's going on in those areas. And for the avoidance of doubt, this provider-specific outreach is only appropriate after they have solicited proposals and failed to obtain one or more proposals to serve that location or locations at issue. So what can we do to prepare for the BEAD funding? The biggest thing that we can do is, one, identify the problem areas where connection is needed throughout our region. Thankfully, we have our speed maps and we have a good idea of it, but make note of when people are complaining about not having service in your region. Find out addresses, because we need address specific location information to challenge the new FCC maps coming out. So the more we know on the ground level, the better. And you can communicate those needs to me as well, and I can get them up to Peter in the state broadband office. Communication. Communicate needs with the state broadband office. Like I just said, you can communicate those needs to me, you can communicate them to Peter. I am more than happy. I speak with them regularly. I'm currently assisting with the Community Accelerator program, and I speak with Peter and Patrick at least once a week. I'm more than happy to take your needs, communicate it with them during the stakeholder outreach, and make sure that the needs of the region are represented in this programming. And then partnership. Now is the time to begin speaking with potential partners, whether that be Buckeye Hills, whether it be your county commissioners, whether it be a local nonprofit who's looking to start up their own broadband service, or if it's a local cooperative or even a small local ISP. The time is now to start talking about it so that we can have the plans ready for when the applications open up and you can just throw it in there, especially because having spoken with Peter and Patrick during the Ohio Residential Broadband Expansion Grant process, they want applications submitted early because they are more than willing to sit down and look at that application. And if something is wrong or you can get more points, they will tell you and allow you to revise it. So the sooner we can put applications in, the better. So now let's move on to the Digital Equity Act. So the Digital Equity Act, we've broken down into 3 different parts. So first is the competitive grant program, which will be specifically from NTIA, but again, funding will go to the states. First, the state will get the planning grants for $60 million. And then there's the state capacity grant program, which is $1.44 billion, which comes after the states make their plans, which we can see on the next slide with the Digital Equity Act timeline. So again, the NOFO was released on May 13th of this year. Applications for those funds are due to NTIA by July 12th of this year from the states. The states are the only ones who can apply for this. States will then begin receiving funds for planning sometime in September of this year. And they'll have 12 full months for planning. Complete plans will then be due to NTIA fall of 2023. States will then begin accepting applications and awarding subgrants within the state in spring 2024 for the state capacity grants. Within the first month of the state awarding those capacity grant programs, the NTIA will then open up the competitive grant program nationally for those that have applied to the state program and maybe didn't receive funding or are looking for other sources for funding. The state capacity grants will have a 5-year implementation period, and the NTIA competitive grants will have a 4-year implementation period. So what are the Digital Equity Act requirements? I know it looks like this is a very short slide, but trust me, it is not. It's just there's so much information I needed to break it up into parts. So the biggest thing is that there needs to be a clear description of the state's vision for digital equity in the context of its overarching strategy and goals. And then there are statutory requirements and additional requirements. So let's get into the statutory requirements. So they first need to have an identification of barriers to digital equity faced by covered populations. They need to have measurable objectives for documenting and promoting programs among each covered population located in the state, which has to include the availability, affordability, and accessibility of fixed and wireless broadband, accessibility and inclusivity of online public resources and services, the digital literacy levels throughout the state, awareness of and the use of measures of cybersecurity with respect to an individual, and the availability and affordability of devices and technical services for those devices. It also has to include an assessment of how the measurable objectives listed above will impact economic workforce development, educational outcomes, health outcomes, civic and social engagement, and the delivery of other essential services. Like I said, there's a lot, so I needed to break this up into multiple parts. The statutory requirements also require the state to collaborate with key stakeholders, which may include community anchor institutions, county and municipal governments, educational agencies, where it's applicable, Native American tribes, Alaskan Native entities, and Native Hawaiian organizations. They have to collaborate with nonprofit organizations that represent individuals with disabilities, aging individuals, individuals with language barriers, veterans, and those incarcerated in non-federal facilities, civil rights organizations, entities carrying out workforce development programs, adult education agencies of the state, public housing authorities, and any partnerships of these organizations. In this stakeholder engagement, there are a few requirements. They're required to use a variety of communications methods. They're required to provide information in appropriate languages for the target demographics they're trying to reach. And along with those, they're encouraged to also collaborate with covered populations with lived experience of being disconnected, state agencies, labor unions, and digital inclusion coalitions, chambers of commerce, public housing resident associations and healthcare systems, homeless continuation of care providers, and faith-based organizations, business owners, foundations and their funders, early childhood and early intervention coordinators, reentry organizations, and internet service providers. So the additional requirements as listed before. In their digital equity plan, they will also need to have a digital equity vision statement. They will have to do a needs assessment for state digital equity. They'll need an asset inventory of existing digital equity resources. They'll have to have a coordination and outreach strategy, a description of how existing plans will be incorporated into the state plan, a holistic implementation strategy, an explanation of how that strategy addresses gaps in already existing efforts, a description of how the state will accomplish its strategy by engaging with workforce agencies, community organizations, and higher education institutions, an implementation outline, timeline, and an outline of how the state will coordinate Digital Equity Act, BEAD, and other funding sources. And the reason that we've thrown these two in together today for one webinar is that with the BEAD planning, they're essentially required to do the Digital Equity Act planning at the same time, because the BEAD planning also needs to have digital equity components within it. And though the BEAD plan is due much sooner than the Digital Equity Act, what has been told by NTIA is essentially put what you have first. So for like an initial proposal into the BEAD funding, and then it can be addressed further on, and it can be addressed further on in the final proposal so that everything is represented from both plans, and the teams for both plans are required to work on both plans. So their digital equity team will be working on the expansion, and the expansion team will also assist with digital equity. So what can we do to prepare for the Digital Equity Act? One big thing with digital equity is the formation of coalitions. So we at Buckeye Hills have our broadband committee, and a big thing that we talk about is digital equity. We just recently finished a digital asset inventory for digital equity services throughout the region, a lot of it being libraries and our OMJ offices and OSU extension offices and so forth. And typically that is how it is in rural areas. You don't have a ton of auxiliary organizations performing the roles that are already filled by a lot of the organizations already here. But find a digital equity coalition to join, or form one of your own if there's not already one near you. You're more than welcome to come to the Buckeye Hills Regional Council Broadband Committee, but I also encourage everyone to join the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. There is a free level to join to be a friend of NTIA, where you'll be added to the listservs and you can come on the community calls once a month. We are a subscriber so that we can be a part of the working groups, so we can make sure that rural voices are heard and rural issues are heard as they're creating tools and assets for people to use across the country when it comes to digital equity. Then identify if there isn't an asset map of your area when it comes to digital equity needs and digital equity services in your area. I highly recommend getting on that now, especially as the state is required to do that stakeholder outreach when creating their plan. If you have a digital asset inventory that you can share with them for your area, all the better, because they're required to do that anyway. And so you've helped solve their problem and help them get a step ahead. And then plan and communicate. You can create a digital equity plan for your area, of which the best examples are on the National Digital Inclusion Alliance's website. They have digital equity plans from all across the country, from city level up all the way up to regional level. But then communicate the plan to the state and actively participate in the state planning process, especially as the stakeholder engagement is going on. I know I've spoken with Peter and Patrick, and if people have these digital equity plans already ready to go, it makes their jobs and lives so much easier. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. And if you don't have any questions right now, you can always send me questions later at my email listed here. You can call me or text me at 740-336-2042. And then you can follow us on all of our socials and on LinkedIn there below. If anybody has any questions, you can just unmute yourself or you can plug it into the chat.
Hey, Ryan, this is Gwen and Noble. So do you envision that the state's plan will just, for lack of a better term, dump this money into the broadband process they already have, or will there be a separate type of?
So there has to be a separate type of thing, simply because the previous broadband program does not meet the requirements for the BEAD program. So the previous broadband program was created when the standard for broadband was still that 25.3. But there's a lot of updated standards for the federal funds. Peter and his team are currently they have received all the proposals because they put out an RFP for a BEAD consultant to work with them to design that new program. Because there are so many other like little requirements that I didn't even include here because it's really nitpicky, and that's more for the state level, and it has to do with like labor laws and where they can get materials from and things that we don't necessarily need to be concerned with. We need to know like how to apply. But when it comes to the state planning, they're bringing on a consultant to help them change that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, they should have that consultant on in the next month or so. I know that when I saw Peter in person last at the end of May, they were going through the RFPs and kind of scoring them to bring that consultant on. And then, like I said, they have to submit the LOI by the middle of July. And then they'll get the $5 million in planning funds in order to start creating that new program. Thankfully, we already have the framework of a program. I know that they want to include the accountability measures that they had in the ORBEG program. They want to continue those on to the next program. The biggest thing is they just have to update the standards for the infrastructure, and they have to update the standards for like the low cost and middle class option, and just all the new additional things that BEAD is throwing in.